The Gulfstream G650 touched down at Teterboro just after sunset, the kind of golden hour that made even New Jersey look like it had been dipped in honey. Augustus Sterling Gus, to the handful of people who'd earned the right, stepped onto the tarmac in a midnight blue Brioni tuxedo that had cost more than most people's cars. The Vacheron Constantin patrimony on his wrist caught the last of the light, its platinum case throwing off a cold gleam that matched the set of his jaw. Richard Pembroke, his chief of staff, fell into step beside him, tablet already glowing with the evening's logistics. The driver held open the door of the black Maybach engine, purring like a panther that had just spotted prey. Gus paused before ducking inside, looking back at the jet. 24 months ago, she'd married me as the electrician. 12 months ago, she divorced me, thinking I'd never amount to anything. Tonight, 300 people are about to learn the truth. The Maybach pulled away from the private terminal, and Gus let himself sink into the leather. Richard was talking guest list seating arrangements, the photographer's angle for maximum coverage, but the words washed over him like white noise. His mind had already drifted backward to a different kind of transport entirely. 24 months earlier, he'd been sitting in a 2003 Ford F-150 with rust eating through the wheel wells, parked outside a coffee shop in Brooklyn that served overpriced lattes to people who thought exposed brick was a personality trait. The truck was a prop, same as the Carhartt jacket with the frayed cuffs and the work boots that had actual electrical tape holding the sole together, every detail calculated, every thread authentic enough to pass inspection by people who'd never actually done a day's labor in their lives. Catherine had died, chasing the kind of life that looked good in photographs. Heart attack at 31, collapsing in the middle of a charity gala she'd insisted they attend. Her last words a whispered apology for the dress that had cost $8,000 and made her feel like she finally belonged. The doctor said it was a congenital defect, something that could have gone off like a landmine at any moment. But Gus knew better. Stress was a killer with patience, and Catherine had been feeding it for years, trying to keep up with women who measured their worth in carats and square footage. After the funeral, after the parade of people who'd never actually known his wife offered their condolences, Gus had made himself a promise. If he ever loved again, it would be someone who wanted him, not the empire he'd built. Someone who could see past the zeros in the bank account to the man who still remembered what it felt like to have nothing. So he'd created Augustus Sterling Electrician, rented a studio apartment in Greenpoint that smelled like the previous tenant's cat and someone's failed curry experiment. Got himself on the books with a legitimate contracting outfit, took real jobs, fixing real electrical panels in buildings he actually owned through shell companies, so Byzantine even the IRS would need a map. He showed up on time, did the work, collected paychecks that went straight into a separate account he never touched. Built a life that looked like struggle from every angle. And then he'd walked into that coffee shop, ordered a black coffee because the menu made his teeth hurt, and seen Vivian Ashcroft for the first time. She'd been wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost 3 months of an electrician's salary, her blonde hair pulled back in a style that said, "I'm too busy being important for vanity." She was on her phone heels, clicking against the reclaimed wood floor, totally unaware that she'd just walked through a puddle of spilled oat milk. When she finally sat down, she looked at the stain on her Louboutin and let out a sigh that could have deflated a hot air balloon. Gus had walked over with a handful of napkins. Didn't say anything, just held them out. She'd looked up, startled, then took them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks. Rough morning." Something like that. Her laugh was sharp, practiced. "Try rough year. But hey, at least I'm not the one fixing electrical panels in buildings that should have been condemned in the 90s. The words had come out thoughtless, the kind of casual cruelty people wielded when they thought the target wouldn't understand the insult. Gus had smiled, let it slide off. "Actually, I am the one fixing those panels. Did 3 yesterday." The change in her expression had been instantaneous embarrassment bleeding into curiosity. "Oh God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean, it's fine." Honest work. And that should have been the end of it. Ships passing a moment forgotten by lunch. But Vivian had insisted on buying his coffee, then asked where he was working next, then showed up at the job site the following Tuesday with sandwiches and an apology she'd clearly been rehearsing. Within a month, they were dating. Within 6, she'd said yes to a proposal he'd made in that same coffee shop on one knee in his work clothes because she'd told him she loved that he wasn't trying to be someone he wasn't. The wedding had been small. Vivian's parents, Gregory and Diane Ashcroft, owners of a car dealership empire that sprawled across 3 states, had attended with the kind of frozen smiles people wore to funerals for distant relatives. Her mother had pulled her aside before the ceremony, voice low, but not low enough. "Vivian, sweetheart, it's not too late. We can call this off, say you got cold feet, and no one would blame you." Vivian had pulled away, cheeks flushed. "Mom, I love him." Diane had looked at Gus standing by the altar in a suit that cost $200 and looked every penny of it. "Love doesn't pay for the life you deserve, honey. But fine. Your choice." The marriage had been good for about 3 months. Then the cracks started showing hairline fractures that widened with every dinner party where Vivian introduced him as "my husband. He works in electrical," then changed the subject before anyone could ask follow-up questions. Every time her colleagues asked what he did, and she answered with increasing vagueness. Every family gathering where Gregory would corner him with another pitch about joining the dealership management track, real future, not this trade school nonsense. Gus had endured it all with the patience of someone running a long experiment, took notes, mental and otherwise, watched Vivian grow more distant, more frustrated, more convinced she'd made a mistake that was costing her the respect of people whose respect wasn't worth having. The first time she'd stayed late at work, really late, the kind of late that came with elaborate explanations and a new perfume he hadn't bought her, Gus had known. The second time confirmed it. By the 5th, he'd stopped counting. He'd found out about Preston Vale the old-fashioned way, came home early from a job, saw the texts lighting up her phone on the kitchen counter. Preston was everything Gus wasn't, at least on paper. Investment banker at a mid-tier firm, made $250,000 a year and thought it made him a master of the universe. Drove a leased BMW, lived in a rental that ate half his paycheck, wore suits that screamed trying too hard to anyone who actually knew quality. But to Vivian, Preston was a ticket back to the life she'd thought she was signing up for. Someone who'd look right in the Christmas card photos. Someone her parents could introduce at the country club without that apologetic cringe. The confrontation had been almost boring in its predictability. Gus had left the phone where it was, waited for Vivian to come home, and asked her point blank if there was someone else. She hadn't denied it. Didn't even try. Just looked at him with something close to relief and said the words she'd probably been rehearsing for weeks. "I made a mistake, Gus. You're a good man, but I want more. I want dinners at restaurants where you don't check the prices. I want a husband people respect. I want someone who has ambition." The funny thing was, he'd felt mostly sadness. Not for himself, he'd known this was always a possibility, but for her. For the person she'd become, or maybe the person she'd always been, and he'd just been too optimistic to see. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Vivian." She'd looked startled, like she'd expected a fight. When he'd agreed to the divorce without argument, her relief had been palpable. Her lawyer had offered him $50,000 as a settlement, her parents' money almost certainly designed to make him go away quietly. Gus had looked at the number, thought about the quarterly dividends from Sterling Apex that cleared more than that every week, and pushed the paper back across the table. "Keep it. I don't want anything from you." Vivian's lawyer had actually looked confused. "Mr. Sterling, you're entitled to—" "I said I don't want anything." He'd signed the papers that afternoon. Augustus J. Sterling, in the neat block letters he'd learned in 3rd grade, when the only thing he'd owned of value was a bike with a broken chain and dreams bigger than the trailer park where he'd grown up. The middle initial stood for nothing in particular. He'd added it when he'd incorporated his first company at 22, thought it looked more serious on the paperwork. Vivian hadn't even noticed. Hadn't asked what the J stood for. Hadn't questioned why a man who supposedly barely scraped by needed a middle initial at all. She'd taken the signed decree, stood up, and walked out of his life without a backward glance. That had been 12 months ago. 12 months of watching from a distance as she'd moved into Preston's overpriced rental, posted Instagram photos from restaurants where the portions were small and the smugness was supersized. 12 months of seeing her parents celebrate their daughter's upgrade, of reading the engagement announcement in the Times when Preston had proposed after all of 4 months together. And 12 months of Gus living his double life more carefully than ever. During the day he was still the electrician, still showed up to jobs and did the work and collected checks that meant nothing. But at night he'd shed the costume and become himself again. Board meetings via secure video acquisition approvals, the slow, careful work of building an empire that spanned 4 continents and touched more lives than Vivian would ever know. Ruby had been his anchor through all of it. 8 years old with Catherine's dark hair and Gus's steel-gray eyes sharp as a tack and twice as stubborn. She knew everything, had known from the beginning, because Gus refused to lie to his daughter the way he lied to everyone else. One night, about 6 months after the divorce, she'd asked him the question that had been building behind her eyes for weeks. "Daddy, when are you going to tell Vivian the truth?" They'd been in the kitchen of the brownstone on East 72nd, the one with the original crown molding and the wine cellar that could have doubled as a small restaurant. Ruby was doing homework at the counter, pencil moving across her math worksheet with the kind of fierce concentration that reminded Gus of himself at that age. Maybe never, sweetheart. Sometimes people don't deserve the truth. They just deserve to live with the choices they made. But that's mean. Is it? Or is it just fair? Ruby had thought about that for a long moment, then gone back to her long division. The next week she'd asked if she could invite Vivian to her school play. Gus had said no gently and explained that some bridges once burned weren't worth rebuilding. The invitation to the IPO celebration had arrived 3 months ago, embossed cardstock that probably cost $5 a sheet. Preston's firm was taking a pharmaceutical company public, Apex Biosystems, a scrappy biotech outfit that had developed a promising treatment for a rare pediatric cancer. The IPO was projected to raise $200 million. And the celebration was going to be the kind of over-the-top spectacle that screamed new money trying to look established. What the invitation didn't mention, what Preston's firm apparently didn't know, was that Sterling Apex Holdings owned 40% of Apex Biosystems. Had owned it since the Series A round back, when the company was 4 scientists in a rented lab space and a dream of saving kids who'd run out of options. Gus had read the invitation twice, then called Richard into his office. "I want to attend this. Not as a silent partner. I want full reveal. My name on the program, my seat at the head table. Everything." Richard, who'd worked for Gus long enough to know when to ask questions and when to just execute, had nodded once. "And Mrs. Vale. She'll be there. It's also their wedding reception. 2 birds, 1 very expensive stone." Richard had allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "I'll make the arrangements." The arrangements had taken 3 months of careful choreography. Press releases timed to the minute. Seating charts revised and re-revised. A speech written and rewritten until every word carried the weight Gus needed it to bear. He'd turned down interview requests from Bloomberg, from the Wall Street Journal, from every financial publication that wanted the first crack at the story of the anonymous billionaire finally stepping into the light. Tonight was about something bigger than press. Tonight was about truth delivered like a surgical strike to people who'd spent 2 years convinced they knew exactly who Augustus Sterling was and what he was worth. The Maybach pulled up to the Grand Hyatt, where valets in white gloves were already drowning in a sea of luxury vehicles. Gus waited until they'd opened his door, then stepped out into the camera flashes. A few heads turned, confusion rippling through the crowd. Who was this? Not a celebrity. Not recognizable, but clearly someone important based on the car and the way he carried himself. Richard appeared at his elbow, tablet glowing with the updated schedule. "The program starts in 20 minutes. Your speech is slotted for 8:30, right after the IPO toast and before the first dance." Gus nodded, eyes already scanning the entrance. Through the glass doors, he could see the glitter of the ballroom, ice sculptures, floral arrangements that probably cost more than a decent used car, the kind of excess that happened when people spent other people's money on their own vanity. And there, just visible through the crowd, was Vivian. She was wearing a wedding dress that belonged on a magazine cover. Vera Wang, he'd guess all silk and strategic beading designed to catch every light in the room. Her hair was up, showing off the diamond necklace Preston had probably gone into debt to afford. She was laughing at something someone had said, one hand resting on her stomach in a gesture that was either protective or performative. Gus felt something twist in his chest, not quite pain, but close. She looked happy. She looked like a woman who'd gotten everything she wanted and was counting her blessings in public. The moment stretched crystalline and fragile. Then Vivian's mother stepped into view, and Gus recognized the expression on Diane Ashcroft's face, the same self-satisfied smugness she'd worn at Vivian's wedding to him, except now it was genuine. Her daughter had upgraded, found a real man, someone with a future. Richard touched his arm lightly. Sir Gus took a breath, let it out slowly. "Let's go." They walked through the doors into controlled chaos. The ballroom was everything Gus had expected too much of. Everything the kind of event that would be remembered as tasteless by people with actual taste and aspirational by everyone else. 300 guests milled around drinks and hand voices competing to be heard over the string quartet, playing something that might have been Vivaldi but had been smoothed down until it was just expensive noise. No one noticed him at first. He was just another well-dressed man in a sea of tuxedos, remarkable only for the fact that he was alone and walking with purpose. The crowd parted automatically the way crowds did for people who moved like they owned the space. Gus made his way to the VIP section where tables had been set up in a configuration that put the most important people on display. His name card was there exactly where it should be, Augustus J. Sterling. Sterling Apex Holdings. Next to it, 3 empty seats, Richard and 2 senior partners who were running fashionably late. He sat down, and that's when the recognition started to ripple outward. The CFO of Apex Biosystems spotted him first. David Chen. No relation to anyone Gus knew. Just a brilliant financial mind who'd helped navigate the company through its early chaos, did a double take that would have been comical if it hadn't been so genuine. David crossed the room in 10 strides, hand already extended. "Mr. Sterling, I didn't realize you'd be attending in person. We're honored." Gus shook his hand firm but not crushing. "Wouldn't miss it, David. You've done excellent work getting the company to this point." Around them, other heads were starting to turn. Phones were coming out not to take photos but to Google. Augustus Sterling, Sterling Apex Holdings, the pieces clicking into place for people who tracked money the way gamblers tracked horses. At the bar, Preston Vale was holding court with a cluster of junior bankers, all of them laughing at something he'd said. Preston was in his element, riding the high of a deal that was going to make his year, probably his career. He had no idea that the man sitting 30 feet away owned more of the company he was celebrating than his entire firm did. Vivian was across the room near the entrance, greeting late arrivals with the practiced grace of someone who'd been trained since birth to work a room. She hadn't seen Gus yet, was too busy smiling for a photographer adjusting the drape of her dress, being the perfect bride at the perfect event. The moment stretched. Gus could feel the attention building, a wave gathering force before it crashed. People were starting to whisper, to point with the subtlety of drunk elephants. The name was spreading like a virus through the crowd. Sterling, Apex, the silent partner. He's here. And then Preston's managing director, a man named Howard Blackwell, who'd made his fortune in the 80s and never let anyone forget it, spotted Gus and went pale. Howard crossed the room like his shoes were on fire, hand outstretched in a shake that was more plea than greeting. "Mr. Sterling, we had no idea, that is, we would have arranged for a proper welcome if we'd known you were attending personally." Gus stood, accepted the handshake, kept his expression neutral. "I prefer to keep a low profile, Howard, but tonight seemed worth making an exception." Of course. Please let me introduce you to the team. Derek Jameson, come here now." The junior bankers scrambled over, and that's when Preston finally looked up from his conversation. Looked up and saw his managing director fawning over a man he didn't recognize. Saw the cluster of attention forming around the VIP table, saw the phones and the whispers and the unmistakable energy of someone important being acknowledged. Preston's eyes narrowed, trying to place the face. Had they met before? Was this a client he'd forgotten? Howard was still talking, introducing people, and then he turned and called out across the room, "Preston! Preston, get over here. There's someone you need to meet." Preston set down his drink and walked over, smile already fixed in place, the professional mask of someone who networked for a living. He extended his hand automatically as he approached. Howard made the introduction with the kind of reverence usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Preston Vale, meet Augustus Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Apex Holdings." Preston's hand was already in Gus's, the shake mechanical, and for a moment nothing registered. Just a name, just a title, just another person to charm and impress. And then Preston's brain caught up to his ears. His hand went rigid, mid-shake, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, disbelief, and something close to horror in the space of 3 seconds. "You're—" His voice came out strangled, barely audible over the string quartet. "You're Augustus Sterling, the billionaire." Gus gave him a smile that didn't reach his eyes, pulled his hand back gently. "I prefer not to lead with the net worth, but yes." "Hello, Preston." Howard looked between them, confusion evident. "You two know each other?" Preston's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He was... The words wouldn't come too big to fit through the aperture of his shock. "We've met, Gus," said tone conversational, almost kind. "Preston is married to my ex-wife. Or marrying her. Tonight, I believe. Congratulations." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight that pressed down on everyone in earshot like a physical thing. Howard's expression flickered through several configurations before landing on professional concern. "I see. Well, that's certainly a coincidence." Preston was still staring, his face doing a very good impression of someone who'd just watched their entire understanding of reality take a baseball bat to the knees. "But you were the electrician." Gus tilted his head slightly. "I did electrical work, yes. Still do occasionally. Keeps me grounded. But that was never my primary occupation." Across the room, Vivian had finally noticed the commotion. She was looking their way, trying to see through the crowd, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she recognized Preston's body language, stiff, defensive, the posture of a man who'd just taken a hit he didn't see coming. She started walking over, and Gus felt time slow down the way it always did in moments that would define what came after. This was it. The collision he'd been orchestrating for 12 months, the reveal he'd planned down to the minute. Vivian reached the edge of the group and her eyes found Gus. For a heartbeat there was nothing, just a beautiful woman looking at a stranger in an expensive suit. Then recognition hit, delayed but devastating, and her face went through the same cascade of emotions Preston's had. Shock. Disbelief. The dawning realization that something fundamental had just shifted beneath her feet. "Gus." Her voice was small, swallowed by the noise of the party, but he heard it perfectly. "What are you doing here?" He met her gaze, held it, let her see everything he'd kept hidden for 2 years. "Attending an IPO celebration? Same as you. But how did you—" She looked at Howard, at Preston, at the VIP name card on the table that clearly read his name. "I don't understand." Howard, to his credit, was already doing the math. His firm had done the IPO for Apex Biosystems. Sterling Apex Holdings owned 40% of Apex Biosystems, which meant the man standing in front of him, the man Preston's new wife, had apparently divorced, thinking he was nobody, was their single largest client. "Mrs. Vale," Howard said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating a minefield in dress shoes. "I take it you weren't aware of Mr. Sterling's portfolio?" Vivian looked like she was trying to solve an equation in a language she didn't speak. Gus could see her brain working, trying to reconcile the man in the Carhartt jacket with the man in the Brioni tuxedo, the studio apartment in Greenpoint, with whatever she was learning about him now. Someone's phone went off, a notification chime, one of dozens that would ring over the next few minutes as the news spread beyond the ballroom. Social media was already catching fire because of course it was. Someone had recognized him, posted something, and now the algorithms were doing what they did best, spreading information faster than truth could keep up. Within 90 seconds, half the room was on their phones. Within 3 minutes, people were starting to approach, drawn by the scent of proximity to real money. Gus weathered the attention with practiced ease, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, letting people tell him how much they admired his work, even though most of them had no idea what that work actually was. Vivian stood frozen at the edge of the growing circle, her phone clutched in one hand, her face cycling through emotions too fast to catalog. Preston had retreated to the bar, downing something amber-colored in a single swallow, his expression that of a man watching his career implode in real time. because that's what was happening. Howard had already pulled Preston aside for a terse conversation that involved a lot of hand gestures and the kind of body language that screamed, "This is a disaster." The optics were catastrophic. A junior banker who'd somehow married the ex-wife of their firm's biggest client at an event celebrating a deal that client had made possible. There was no way to spin this that didn't make Preston look like either an idiot or opportunist. The MC, some overpaid professional host who probably didn't know the difference between an IPO and an IPA, stepped up to the microphone and called for everyone's attention. The program was starting. Speeches would be made. The successful IPO would be toasted. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Augustus Sterling would step up to the podium and say the words he'd been crafting for 3 months. Gus returned to his seat, letting the noise wash over him. Richard appeared with a glass of water. Gus didn't drink at events like this, needed his head clear, and leaned in close. "They're asking if you want to adjust the speech, given the circumstances." Gus shook his head. "Every word stays. Exactly as written." Across the room, Vivian had finally moved, making her way to a quiet corner where her mother had materialized like a heat-seeking missile locked onto drama. Diane's phone was out, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, to something that might have been fury, as she read whatever the internet was telling her about the man her daughter had divorced. The speeches began. David Chen talked about the science, the clinical trials, the children who'd get a chance at life because of the work Apex had done. Howard talked about the market, the investor confidence, the bright future ahead. Preston was conspicuously absent from the roster, probably in a bathroom somewhere having a controlled breakdown. And then the MC was introducing Gus, reading from a bio that sounded impressive even to someone who'd lived it. Founder of Sterling Apex Holdings, philanthropist, investor in over 200 companies across 4 continents, estimated net worth, and here the MC paused for effect, $4.8 billion. The room went quiet in a way that felt like a held breath. Gus stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the podium. 300 faces turned toward him, some curious, some envious, some, like Vivian's, still struggling to process what was happening. He looked out at the crowd, let the moment settle, and began to speak. The podium microphone hummed with the kind of feedback that made sound engineers wince. Gus adjusted it downward, the screech cutting through the crystalline silence that had settled over the ballroom like fresh snow. 300 faces tracked his every movement, phones already recording, capturing this moment for the algorithmic immortality of social media. Thank you for that introduction. Though I should clarify, the $4.8 billion is a conservative estimate. My accountants prefer I don't discuss the actual number in public settings. A ripple of nervous laughter rolled through the crowd. Gus let it die naturally before continuing, his voice steady, conversational, the tone of someone discussing the weather rather than dismantling someone's entire worldview. "I want to talk tonight about value. Not the kind that gets printed on stock certificates or flashed across Bloomberg terminals, but the kind that lives in how we treat people when we think no one important is watching." He could see Vivian in his peripheral vision standing near the bar, her champagne untouched. Her mother had a death grip on her arm, probably the only thing keeping Vivian from fleeing through the nearest emergency exit. 2 years ago, I met someone at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. I was dressed like I'd just come from a job site because I had. She was in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent because she could afford it. We started talking. She was brilliant, ambitious, funny when she let her guard down. I fell for her hard enough to leave bruises. The room had gone completely still. Even the catering staff had frozen champagne bottles hovering mid-pour. She had no idea who I was. No idea what I'd built, what I owned, what my bank statements looked like. To her, I was just Gus, the guy who fixed electrical panels and drove a truck held together by rust and optimism. And you know what? For a while, that was exactly what I wanted her to see. Gus paused, let the weight of those words settle. Somewhere in the back, a glass shattered. A waiter's hand had slipped, or maybe someone had thrown it. Impossible to tell. We got married. Small ceremony because she didn't want to make it bigger. I didn't mind. I'd already had the wedding where you invite everyone you barely know. That marriage ended when my wife Catherine died chasing a version of success that killed her before she caught it. Vivian's face had gone the color of bone china. Preston was nowhere to be seen, probably still in the bathroom or possibly halfway to the airport. So when I met someone new, I made a choice. I wanted to know if love could survive without the performance, without the pressure of wealth and expectation. I wanted to see if someone would choose me, just me, when they thought I had nothing to offer except myself. Howard Blackwell was sweating through his tuxedo despite the aggressive air conditioning. The man had built a career on reading rooms, and this room was reading like a Category 5 hurricane about to make landfall. Here's what I learned. She looked at my job and saw limitation, looked at my apartment and saw failure, looked at me standing next to men with better titles and saw a reflection that embarrassed her. Gus's voice never rose, never hardened. He delivered each word with the clinical precision of a surgeon making an incision. When someone with the right credentials showed interest, she made her choice. Not because I wasn't good enough, I was always good enough, but because she needed other people to think she'd made the right choice, and I didn't look right on paper. A murmur ran through the crowd, the sound of 300 people simultaneously realizing they were watching a public execution conducted with perfect etiquette. I signed the divorce papers, took nothing, walked away clean because holding on to someone who's already let go just bruises you both. She moved on, built the life she wanted with someone who checked all her boxes. He looked directly at Vivian for the first time since starting the speech. Her eyes were wet, but no tears had fallen. Yet she had that much control left. I don't tell you this for sympathy. I tell you because tonight, at this celebration for a company that's going to save children's lives, I want to remind everyone here that we show who we are by how we treat people when it costs us nothing to be kind and everything to be cruel. Gus stepped back from the microphone, started to leave the podium, then stopped. Oh, and congratulations on your wedding, Vivian. I genuinely hope you found what you were looking for. Now let's celebrate what actually matters. Apex Biosystems is going to change lives, and that's bigger than any of our personal drama. The applause started uncertain, then built, then crashed over the room in waves. Gus walked back to his seat through a gauntlet of stares that ranged from admiration to horror. Richard was waiting with a fresh glass of water and an expression that might have been pride if pressed. Well played, sir. Gus sat down, watched as the MC scrambled to recover the evening's momentum. The program lurched forward, more speeches, the ceremonial toast to the IPO, the awkward moment when Preston was supposed to say a few words but had apparently vanished into the Manhattan night. Howard covered his voice, projecting a confidence his body language utterly betrayed. Across the room, Vivian's mother was having an animated conversation with Vivian, hands gesturing sharply, her phone screen illuminating her face in harsh blue-white light. Diane Ashcroft had clearly found the internet's version of events and was discovering in real time that her daughter had divorced a man worth more than everyone Diane had ever met combined. The evening spiraled into chaos with the elegant inevitability of a train derailment in slow motion. Guests who'd been ignoring Gus's table suddenly remembered urgent reasons to introduce themselves. Business cards appeared like magic tricks pressed into Richard's hands with pitches that ranged from ridiculous to genuinely impressive. A tech founder wanted funding for an app that used AI to predict breakups. A medical researcher needed backing for a clinical trial. A man in a lime green tuxedo, absolutely no one knew why he was there, tried to sell Gus on a timeshare in Cabo. Richard handled them all with the efficiency of a bouncer at an exclusive club, collecting cards, making polite noises, ensuring exactly none of them got within handshake distance of Gus himself. The dancing started, though calling it dancing was generous. Mostly it was people standing in clusters, phones out refreshing their social media feeds to watch the story metastasize across the internet. Someone had already set up a hashtag, #DivorcedABillionaire. Twitter was having the kind of field day that made PR professionals wake up screaming. Vivian finally moved, peeling away from her mother's grip and walking with purpose toward the exit. She made it 3 steps before being intercepted by a woman Gus recognized as one of her law firm colleagues. Amanda, something senior partner. The kind of person who measured their worth in billable hours and client retention. Vivian, we need to talk. The firm's been getting calls. Clients are asking questions. Vivian's response was inaudible, but her body language screamed, "Leave me alone." Amanda persisted, following her toward the lobby, gesturing at her phone like it contained evidence of war crimes. Gus checked his watch. 9:15. The evening was barely half over, but it already felt like it had aged a decade. His phone buzzed a text from Ruby, who was supposed to be asleep at the brownstone, but was absolutely definitely watching this unfold online because she was 8 and brilliant and had learned how to circumvent parental controls when she was 6. "Daddy, you made her cry. The internet says you made her cry." He typed back quickly. "I told the truth. Sometimes truth hurts worse than lies." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Is she going to be okay?" Gus looked across the room at Vivian, who'd finally made it to the lobby, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender. Eventually. People are resilient when they have to be. The dots vanished. Ruby had either accepted that answer or gone to bed. Probably the former. His daughter had inherited his stubborn streak, along with his eyes. Howard appeared at the table, his smile straining at the edges. "Mr. Sterling, might I have a word?" "Privately." They stepped into a service corridor that smelled like lemon polish and desperation. Howard's composure cracked the moment the door closed behind them. "I need to apologize on behalf of the firm for Preston for—" He gestured vaguely at everything. This entire situation. Gus leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You didn't know. How could you? We should have done better due diligence. Should have realized—" Howard trailed off because there was no way to finish that sentence without admitting his firm had failed basic research on their largest client. Preston's off the Apex account. I assume Howard's laugh was bitter. Preston's off every account. He submitted his resignation 10 minutes ago. Sent it via email from a cab, apparently. Very professional. The news should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt tired. I didn't want him fired, Howard. I wanted transparency. There's a difference. With respect, sir, the optics are impossible. We can't have someone on the team who's romantically involved with— He stopped, recalibrated. "It's a conflict of interest. He's romantically involved with my ex-wife." Ex. Past tense. The divorce was finalized a year ago. Vivian and I have no financial entanglements, no shared assets, no legal connection whatsoever. Howard looked like a man trying to solve a math problem that kept changing variables. Then what was tonight about? Gus pushed off the wall, straightened his jacket. Tonight was about reminding people that actions have consequences. She judged me by assumptions, and I wanted her to understand the cost of those assumptions. The distinction seemed lost on Howard, whose world operated on cleaner binaries: profit and loss, success and failure, client satisfaction and client rage. Gray areas gave him hives. "What do you need from us, Mr. Sterling, to make this right?" "Nothing. The IPO was handled well. Apex is in good shape. Your firm did its job. The personal drama is exactly that, personal." Howard nodded slowly, clearly not believing a word but too smart to argue. "We're here if you need anything at all." They returned to the ballroom where the party had fractured into distinct camps. One group was still trying to celebrate the Apex team, mostly people who'd worked too hard to let someone else's imploding marriage ruin their night. Another group was gossiping with the fervor of people who'd stumbled into a reality show taping. A third had given up entirely and was treating the open bar like a challenge to be conquered. Vivian had returned, though calling her present was optimistic. She stood near the cake, a 3-tiered monstrosity decorated with sugar flowers that probably cost more than the average wedding, staring at it like it contained the answers to questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. Her father Gregory materialized beside her, his face the deep crimson of a man whose blood pressure was staging a hostile takeover. They spoke in sharp whispers, Gregory's hands chopping the air in angry punctuation. Gus couldn't hear the words, but he could read the body language well enough. Gregory was furious at Vivian for the divorce, at himself for not investigating Gus more thoroughly, at the universe for making him look like a fool in front of people whose opinions he'd spent decades courting. A photographer approached Gus's table camera at the ready. "Mr. Sterling, would you mind if I got a few shots for the event coverage?" Gus waved him off. "I'd prefer not. Tonight isn't about me." The photographer looked confused. What else could tonight possibly be about at this point, but retreated without argument. Richard leaned in, voice low. "Sir, we have a situation developing. Mrs. Vale's attorney just arrived." Gus followed Richard's gaze to the entrance where a woman in a severe black suit was scanning the room with the focused intensity of a predator that had caught a scent. She spotted Vivian and moved like a missile with purpose. The attorney Miranda Blackstone. Gus recognized her from the divorce proceedings, reached Vivian, and immediately pulled her aside. Their conversation was brief, intense, and concluded with Vivian shaking her head violently, tears finally breaking through her defenses. Miranda approached Gus's table with the confidence of someone who'd never lost an argument she cared about winning. "Mr. Sterling, I represent Vivian Vale. She'd like to speak with you, privately if possible." Gus considered the request. There was nothing to be gained from another conversation, nothing that could be said that would change the fundamental architecture of what had happened. But refusing felt petty, and he'd already made his point. 5 minutes. No more. They found a small conference room off the main ballroom, the kind hotels kept for business travelers who needed to take calls without disturbing other guests. Miranda held the door, then closed it behind them, leaving Gus and Vivian alone in a space that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. Vivian had been crying, her makeup was smudged, her eyes red-rimmed, but she'd pulled herself together enough to speak. "You lied to me." Her voice cracked on the last word, turning it into an accusation and a plea simultaneously. "I never lied. You asked what I did for work, I told you. I fixed electrical systems. That was true. You let me believe you were poor. I let you assume. There's a difference." Vivian's hands were shaking. She clasped them together, maybe to still them, maybe to keep herself from throwing something. "That's semantics, Gus. You knew what I thought. You could have corrected me at any point. I could have. But then I'd never know if you loved me or my money. And after Catherine died chasing status, that didn't matter. I needed to know. So you tested me. Set me up to fail." Gus shook his head slowly. "I gave you a chance to show me who you were. You showed me. That's not setting you up. That's just removing the stage makeup so I could see what was underneath." The silence that followed had teeth. Vivian looked at him like she was seeing someone new, or maybe seeing him clearly for the first time. "I loved you. Past tense. Noted. I did. Before Preston. Before I knew about—" She gestured at him, at the tuxedo, at everything the tuxedo represented. "I loved the man in the work boots who brought me coffee and listened when I complained about my cases. That man is the same person standing here now. Same values, same priorities. The only difference is you know what's in my bank account. That's not a small difference, Gus. It shouldn't be any difference at all. Not if you actually loved me." Vivian flinched like he'd slapped her. "You don't get to judge me for wanting stability, for wanting a partner who could provide. I provided plenty, paid rent, bought groceries, supported you through the bar exam. The fact that I could have bought the building doesn't change that I showed up every day and treated you like you mattered. But you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." Gus felt something cold settle in his chest, heavy and final. "You're right. I didn't trust you. And everything that happened after proved I was right not to." Vivian's face crumpled. "So, what now? You've humiliated me in front of 300 people, destroyed my wedding, probably cost Preston his job. Is that enough? Or do you want more blood?" "I don't want your blood, Vivian. I wanted you to understand that character matters more than credentials. That the way you treat people when they can't do anything for you says everything about who you actually are. And what do I say? What does tonight say about me?" Gus walked to the door, hand on the handle. "You judged a book by its cover and threw away something real for something shiny. You failed the only test that matters, the one that asks if you can see people clearly instead of seeing what you want them to be." He opened the door, paused with one foot in the corridor. "For what it's worth, I hope Preston makes you happy. I hope you build the life you wanted with the dinners at expensive restaurants and the Instagram photos that make other people jealous. I genuinely hope it fills whatever you're trying to fill." Vivian was crying openly now, mascara tracking down her cheeks in dark rivulets. "And what about you? What do you get out of tonight?" Gus looked back at her one last time. This woman he'd loved enough to lie for, to test, to let go, when it became clear she was chasing something he couldn't give her even with unlimited resources. Clarity. And a reminder that I'd rather build something real with someone who sees clearly than perform for someone who only loves the performance. He left her in the conference room, the door clicking shut with the finality of a period at the end of a long, complicated sentence. The party had devolved further in his absence. Someone had cranked up the music in an attempt to salvage the celebration that was landing somewhere between desperate and delusional. A group of junior analysts were doing shots at the bar, toasting to scandals and poor life choices. The Apex team had claimed a corner and were determinedly enjoying themselves, refusing to let other people's drama contaminate their victory. Richard intercepted Gus halfway back to the table. "Sir, there's been a development. Mrs. Vale is pregnant." The words hit like a physical blow. Gus stopped walking, processed the information through layers of shock and confusion. "How do you know that her mother was shouting about it in the lobby?" "Apparently Vivian told her family last week, 3 months along." Gus did the math, automatically counting backward from tonight. 3 months would put conception at roughly 9 months after the divorce, which meant the baby was definitely Preston's, conceived well after the marriage had ended and the ink had dried on papers neither of them could take back. And Preston knows, according to the mother, yes. It's why they rushed the wedding. Preston wanted to make it official before the pregnancy became obvious. Gus felt something twist in his chest, not jealousy exactly, but something adjacent to it. Vivian was building the family she'd wanted, just with someone else. Someone who'd fit better in the Christmas card photo, at least on paper. "Does this change anything, sir?" For tonight, Gus thought about it. A baby changed everything and nothing. Vivian had made her choice before she knew she was pregnant. Had chosen Preston, chosen the life he represented, chosen credentials over character. The baby just made the choice, permanent added weight to a decision that was already final. No, nothing changes. She made her choice. The baby just means she'll live with it longer. They returned to the table where the evening was finally winding down. Guests were starting to leave, air-kissing their goodbyes, promising to do lunch next week in voices that carried no conviction. The photographers had packed up, having gotten enough material to feed the gossip machine for weeks. Diane Ashcroft appeared in Gus's peripheral vision, bearing down on him with the determination of a woman who'd decided confrontation was the only path forward. Richard moved to intercept, but Gus waved him off. "You destroyed my daughter's wedding." Diane's voice shook with fury, barely contained by social convention. "Your daughter destroyed her own wedding when she married a man she barely knows while carrying his child fresh off divorcing someone she judged for having the wrong job title. How dare you? Vivian loved you. She gave you everything. She gave me contempt disguised as concern. She gave me embarrassment disguised as pragmatism. She gave me up the second someone shinier came along." Diane's hand twitched, and for a moment Gus thought she might actually slap him. Instead, she clenched her fist nails, digging into her palm hard enough to leave marks. "You could have told her the truth at any time. This is on you as much as her." Gus met her eyes, unflinching. "I wanted to know if your daughter could love someone for who they are instead of what they have. She couldn't. That's not on me, that's on how you raised her to measure worth." Diane's face went the color of curdled milk. "You sanctimonious." The only person Vivian should be angry at is herself. She had someone who loved her genuinely, and she threw it away for someone who loved her conditionally. That's not my failure. It's hers. Diane opened her mouth for a rebuttal, then seemed to realize she was shouting at a billionaire in the middle of a ballroom while her daughter's wedding dissolved around her. She spun on her heel and stalked away, heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. The last hour of the evening passed in a haze of mechanical social interaction. Gus shook hands with people whose names he wouldn't remember, accepted congratulations for a speech that had eviscerated someone in public, smiled for photos he'd never look at. The Apex team thanked him profusely. Their company was going to thrive, and tonight's drama would be forgotten as soon as the stock started climbing. Midnight approached like a deadline. The ballroom emptied in waves, leaving behind the detritus of celebration, abandoned champagne flutes, wilted flowers, a 3-tiered wedding cake that no one had cut. The catering staff moved through the wreckage with practiced efficiency, erasing evidence of the evening's excess. Gus found himself standing alone near the windows looking out at the Manhattan skyline glittering against the dark. The city looked beautiful from up here, scrubbed clean of its grime and struggle reduced to light and geometry. Ruby texted again. "Are you okay, Daddy?" He typed back slowly, choosing words carefully. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Tonight was hard but necessary. Like pulling a splinter hurts in the moment, but you feel better after. Did you love her, Vivian?" The question sat on his screen, waiting for an answer he wasn't sure he had anymore. "I loved who I thought she was. Turns out I was wrong about who that was. That's sad." "Yeah, it is. But being sad about something true is better than being happy about something false." The dots appeared and vanished several times before Ruby's final message came through. "Mom would be proud of you for being honest, even when it hurt." Gus stared at those words until they blurred. Catherine would have understood tonight, had understood in her final days that authenticity mattered more than appearance, that loving someone meant accepting them wholly, not just the parts that looked good in photographs. "Thank you, sweetie. Now go to sleep. School tomorrow. Already asleep. This is Dream Ruby texting you." Despite everything, Gus smiled. "Good night, Dream Ruby." Richard approached with Gus's coat and the kind of expression that suggested the car was waiting and escape was imminent. The evening had achieved what it set out to achieve, though Gus wasn't entirely sure what that achievement meant yet. They walked through the lobby past clusters of guests still processing the evening's revelations. Gus caught fragments of conversation. "Did you hear 4.8 billion? Can you imagine she must be dying and let them wash over him like weather?" The Maybach was idling at the curb, warm and quiet, and ready to carry him away from this entire mess. Gus climbed in, sank into leather that cost more than some people's cars, and let Richard close the door on the ballroom, the wedding, the evening's controlled demolition. The car pulled into traffic, and Gus watched the Grand Hyatt shrink in the rearview mirror. Somewhere in that building, Vivian was probably still crying or angry or both. Preston was probably still fleeing, putting distance between himself and a disaster he'd stumbled into without realizing he was standing on a landmine. Gus felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just exhaustion and the strange emptiness that comes after you've been carrying something heavy for so long that you forget what it feels like to stand up straight. His phone buzzed one last time, a news alert. The story had hit Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, every major financial outlet. Photos from the ballroom were already circulating. Gus at the podium, Vivian, in her wedding dress, the moment crystallized for public consumption. The headline on Bloomberg made him wince. Billionaire reveals identity at ex-wife's wedding crashes celebration. Not quite accurate, he'd been invited, but accuracy had never been journalism's strong suit. Richard glanced back from the front seat. "Home, sir." Gus nodded. "Home. And Richard, clear my schedule tomorrow morning. I'm spending the day with Ruby. We're going to the Natural History Museum, the one with the dinosaurs." "That's the one. She's been asking to see the titanosaur again." "Very good, sir. I'll make the arrangements." The Maybach hummed north, carrying Gus through a city that looked different now than it had this morning. He'd walked into tonight knowing exactly what he was going to do and say. He was leaving uncertain what any of it meant or whether the truth he'd revealed had done anything except create more wreckage. Vivian would recover. People like her always did, cushioned by family money and social networks and the kind of resilience that came from never having to worry about true hardship. She'd raise her child with Preston, build the life she wanted, maybe even be happy if she could stop comparing herself to everyone around her. And Gus. Tomorrow he'd wake up and be Augustus Sterling again, the billionaire whose identity was no longer secret. The man who'd become a cautionary tale about testing the people you love, or a hero who'd exposed shallow materialism depending on who was telling the story. But tonight, in the darkness of the car, he could feel the weight of it all pressing down. Catherine's death, Vivian's betrayal, the 2 years of performance and secrecy. He'd thought revealing the truth would set him free. Instead, it just made him realize how much he'd lost in the process of proving he was right. The brownstone appeared through the window, warm lights glowing in the windows where Ruby had left them on. Home. Safety. The one person in his life who knew everything and loved him anyway. Gus climbed out of the car, thanked Richard, and walked up the steps to his front door. Tomorrow would bring consequences he couldn't predict yet. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out what to do with the truth now that everyone knew it. But tonight he just needed to check on his daughter and remember why any of this mattered in the first place. The truth was out. The consequences were just beginning. And for the first time in 2 years, Gus had no idea what came next. The Natural History Museum opened at 10, but Gus and Ruby arrived at 9:40, early enough to beat the school groups that would swarm the dinosaur halls by noon. Ruby was wearing her favorite dress, navy blue with white stars, the one Catherine had bought her 3 birthdays ago. That was getting too small, but Ruby refused to retire. She held Gus's hand as they walked through the entrance, her grip tight with the kind of excitement that made 8-year-olds bounce on their toes. The titanosaur skeleton loomed in the main hall, its neck arching toward the ceiling in a curve that defied reasonable engineering. Ruby stopped dead, staring up at bones that had spent millions of years in the ground before someone decided they belonged in Manhattan. "Daddy, do you think it knew it was going to be this famous, the dinosaur?" Probably not. Most things don't know they're going to matter until long after they're gone. Ruby processed this with the seriousness she brought to all philosophical questions. "Like you and Vivian. She didn't know you were famous until after you were gone." Gus squeezed her hand gently. "Something like that. Though I was already famous, she just didn't know where to look." They wandered through the fossil halls, Ruby peppering him with questions about extinction events and continental drift, and whether the dinosaurs had any idea what was coming when the asteroid hit. Gus answered what he could and made up plausible-sounding responses for the rest, the way parents had been doing since someone first asked why the sky was blue. His phone had been buzzing since sunrise. Richard with updates, journalists requesting interviews, a concerning number of voicemails from people who'd gotten his private number through means he'd have to investigate later. Gus had silenced it after the first dozen notifications. Today was for Ruby, and the rest of the world could wait. They stopped for hot dogs from a vendor outside the museum, eating on the steps while pigeons staged aggressive negotiations for dropped crumbs. Ruby got mustard on her dress and didn't care which Gus took as a sign she was genuinely happy. "Are you sad about Vivian?" The question came out of nowhere, the way children's questions often did, ambushing adults who thought they'd successfully changed the subject. Gus considered his answer carefully, watching a pigeon try to steal an entire hot dog from a distracted tourist. "I'm sad it didn't work out. But I'm not sad. I learned the truth." Does that make sense? I think so. Like when Sarah Lancaster said she'd be my best friend, but then told everyone I was weird for liking rocks. Ruby had come home crying about that incident last month, her carefully organized rock collection suddenly a source of shame instead of pride. Exactly like that. Better to know Sarah cares more about being popular than being a real friend. Ruby nodded, took another bite of hot dog. "I'm glad you're not married to her anymore. She made you pretend to be poor, and pretending is exhausting." The wisdom of that statement hit Gus harder than he'd expected. "You're right. Pretending is exhausting. I'm glad it's over." They finished lunch and headed to Queens, the Maybach drawing stairs in neighborhoods where luxury cars were rare enough to be events. The diner Ruby loved was tucked between a laundromat and a dollar store, its neon sign flickering "Eats" in letters that had probably been pink once, but had faded to a color that didn't have a name. Inside the booths were red vinyl patched with duct tape, the air thick with the smell of bacon grease and coffee that had been sitting on the burner since the Reagan administration. Ruby climbed into their usual booth, already reaching for the syrup before the waitress brought menus. The waitress, Gloria 60-something with hair dyed a red that nature had never intended, recognized them immediately. "Well, if it isn't my favorite pancake enthusiast. The usual honey extra chocolate chips, please." Gloria wrote it down, then looked at Gus with an expression that suggested she'd seen the news. "And for you, Mr. Sterling? Or should I be calling you sir now?" Gus managed to smile. "Gloria's fine. Black coffee and whatever Ruby doesn't finish." Gloria hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "For what it's worth, that ex-wife of yours was a damn fool. Anyone with eyes could see you were quality money or no money." "I appreciate that, Gloria. She left to put in the order and Ruby kicked her feet under the table, not quite reaching the floor. "Gloria's nice. She doesn't care that you're rich. That's because Gloria judges people by how they treat waitresses, not by how they look on paper." The pancakes arrived swimming in chocolate chips and whipped cream, a violation of every nutritional guideline, but exactly what Ruby had ordered. She dug in with the focus of a surgeon performing a delicate operation, syrup pooling around the edges of her plate. Gus sipped his coffee and watched her eat, his phone still silenced in his pocket. The outside world could burn for a few more hours. Right now, the only thing that mattered was Ruby's happiness and the structural integrity of her pancake tower. They were halfway through breakfast when the bell above the door chimed and Preston Vale walked in. He looked terrible, unshaven, soot-rumpled eyes, carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from not sleeping, because every time you closed your eyes, you saw your life falling apart in high definition. He spotted Gus, immediately froze for a heartbeat, then walked over with the mechanical determination of someone who'd been rehearsing this conversation all night. "Gus, can we talk?" Ruby looked up from her pancake syrup on her chin, assessing Preston with the brutal honesty of children who hadn't learned to hide their judgments yet. "You're the man who married Vivian." Preston blinked clearly, not expecting to negotiate with an 8-year-old. "Yes, I am. She says you're better than my dad because you have a real job. But you don't look better. You look sad." Preston's face did something complicated. "Ruby, maybe go wash up the bathrooms right over there." Ruby looked at Gus, who nodded. She slid out of the booth, taking her time, clearly hoping to overhear whatever came next. Preston sat down across from Gus, uninvited, his hands clasped on the table like he was praying or preparing to beg. "I lost my job. Officially, I resigned. Practically, I was fired with enough courtesy to keep it off my permanent record." "I heard. I'm sorry. Are you—" "Because from where I'm sitting, you orchestrated the whole thing. The IPO, the public reveal, all of it designed to humiliate me and destroy Vivian." Gus set down his coffee, met Preston's eyes directly. "I didn't orchestrate anything. I was invited to an event celebrating a company I own 40% of. I gave a speech about value and authenticity. The humiliation was a side effect, not the goal." "Bullshit. You knew exactly what would happen when you showed up. You wanted to rub our faces in it. What I wanted was for Vivian to understand that she judged me based on incomplete information and made a choice she can't take back. What you're experiencing is collateral damage." Preston's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Collateral damage. My career is collateral damage. Vivian's reputation is collateral damage. Our entire future is collateral damage to your little morality play. You married a woman barely 4 months after she divorced me. A woman who was already carrying your child when you proposed. Don't pretend you're some innocent victim here." The color drained from Preston's face. "She told you about the baby. Her mother was shouting about it in the hotel lobby. It wasn't exactly a secret." Preston slumped back in the booth, all the fight leaking out of him. "Yeah, 3 months along now. We found out about 6 weeks ago. She was already 8 weeks when we discovered it. I proposed the next day because—" He trailed off, searching for words. "Because I thought it was the right thing to do, or because a wife and baby made you look stable to the partners you were trying to impress." Preston flinched. "Maybe that was part of it. But I do love her. I know you don't believe that, but I do." Gus studied him. This man who'd been a convenient villain in his head for months, who was turning out to be more complicated than the role required. "I believe you think you love her. Whether that love survives the reality of who she is when the shine wears off, that's a different question." Ruby returned from the bathroom, climbed back into the booth, and resumed eating like Preston wasn't even there. Her talent for selective invisibility was admirable. Preston looked at her, then back at Gus. "The baby, it's mine, right? The timeline works." Gus could have twisted the knife, let Preston squirm in uncertainty. Instead, he chose honesty. "Yes, it's yours. Vivian and I had been divorced for 9 months when she got pregnant. The math is clean." Preston exhaled, some tension releasing from his shoulders. Okay, good. I thought maybe—" He stopped, shook his head. "Never mind what I thought. You thought maybe she'd been unfaithful to both of us. And you were raising my mistake. She wasn't. As far as I know, Vivian was faithful to me until she decided she was done. Then she moved on fast, but that's different from cheating. How are you so calm about this? You loved her. She left you. I'd be furious. Gus picked up his coffee, found it had gone cold. I was furious. For about a week. Then I realized fury was just another way of letting her control my life. So I let it go and focused on making sure she understood the consequences of her choice. And now that she understands, now I move on. Find someone who wants me for who I am, not what I have. Build a life that doesn't require lying to feel authentic. Preston stood up, and in his eyes Gus saw the broken pieces of a man who'd thought he was winning when he was actually stepping onto a sinking ship. Good luck with that. For what it's worth, I hope you find her. Someone who sees you. He walked out without ordering, the bell above the door chiming his exit. Ruby watched him go, then looked at Gus with the kind of perception that made him wonder if she could read minds. He's going to leave Vivian. Maybe not today, but soon. She's going to eat him alive. Gus shouldn't have smiled, but he did. You're probably right. Finish your pancakes. The afternoon dissolved into errands that felt blessedly normal, picking up dry cleaning, stopping at the bookstore where Ruby spent 20 minutes agonizing between two novels about girls who discovered they had magic powers, grabbing coffee at a place that didn't know or care who Gus was. The rhythms of ordinary life precious precisely because they were becoming rare. By the time they got back to the brownstone, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that looked fake but weren't. Ruby ran upstairs to read her new book, and Gus finally reluctantly turned his phone back on. 143 notifications. Texts, emails, voicemails, missed calls from numbers he recognized, and dozens he didn't. The internet had spent the day in a frenzy dissecting every frame of the ballroom footage, every word of his speech, every detail of his history they could excavate. Richard had sent a summary. 3 interview requests from major networks, 5 from financial publications, 2 from podcasts, whose hosts thought they were journalists. Social media had dubbed him alternately a hero, a villain, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of testing people you claim to love. A think piece in the Times questioned the ethics of his deception. A response piece in the Post argued Vivian deserved everything she got. According to Richard's notes, Diane Ashcroft had retreated to the family's Connecticut estate by Monday evening, refusing all media inquiries and instructing her country club friends that the family required privacy during this difficult transition. Gregory had gone with her, closing the dealerships for a week and citing personal matters. Even in disaster, the Ashcrofts maintained appearances couldn't let anyone see the cracks in the carefully constructed facade of success. Gus deleted most of it without reading. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict, and like all verdicts rendered by mobs, it was loud, confident, and ultimately meaningless. One email stood out, though. Sender Vivian.Vale@ashcroftlaw.com. Subject no subject. Sent at 3:47 p.m. He stared at it for a full minute before opening it. Gus, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to read this, but I need to say it anyway for my own sanity if nothing else. You were right, about everything. I judged you by your job, your apartment, your truck. I looked at the surface and decided I knew what was underneath. I was wrong, and that wrongness cost me something I didn't know I had until it was gone. I'm not asking for another chance. I know that ship sailed, burned, and sank. I'm asking you to understand that I didn't leave you because you weren't enough. I left because I thought I wasn't enough, and being with someone successful would prove to my parents, my friends, myself that I deserved the life I wanted. Turns out I had the life I wanted and was too stupid to recognize it. Preston is a good man. He'll be a good father. But he's not you, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life knowing I traded something real for something shiny. I hope you find someone who deserves you. Someone who sees you for who you are from the beginning, who doesn't need a billion-dollar reveal to understand your worth. I hope you're happy, Gus. One of us should be. V. Gus read it twice, looking for hidden barbs or manipulation, found neither. Just regret, genuine and raw, from someone who'd learned a lesson too expensive to ignore. He didn't reply. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like gloating or pity, and Vivian didn't need either. She needed to live with her choice, raise her child, build whatever life was possible with the wreckage of the one she'd destroyed. The doorbell rang at 7:30. Gus checked the security camera. A woman, early 30s, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a paramedic's uniform with a jacket thrown over it. She was holding a manila envelope and looked nervous. He opened the door, recognition firing immediately. Margaret Brennan. Maggie, the paramedic whose brother had received a Sterling Apex scholarship last year for electrical engineering studies. Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry to show up unannounced. I tried calling, but your number's not public and I didn't want to go through official channels because this is personal, not business, and I'm rambling. I'm sorry. I'm nervous. Her honesty was disarming. Gus stepped back, holding the door open. Come in, please. Maggie entered carefully, taking in the brownstone with wide eyes, the original woodwork, the art on the walls, the kind of casual wealth that made normal people feel like they'd stumbled into a museum after hours. Ruby appeared at the top of the stairs, book in hand. Daddy, who's that, a friend? Ruby, this is Maggie. Maggie, my daughter Ruby. Maggie waved, and Ruby waved back, her assessment of strangers always swift and usually accurate. She looks nice. Can she stay for dinner? I haven't invited her yet, sweetheart. Maggie laughed, some of the tension bleeding out of her shoulders. I actually can't stay. I'm on shift in an hour. I just wanted to drop this off and say thank you in person. She handed Gus the envelope. Inside were photographs, her brother Kevin at his electrical engineering graduation, wearing a Sterling Apex Foundation scholarship medallion. Kevin on a job site hard hat and tool belt, grinning at the camera. Kevin with their parents, an older couple whose faces showed the kind of weathering that came from decades of physical labor. Kevin wanted me to give you these. He said everyone assumes scholarship recipients are just names on a tax form to people like you. He wanted you to see that he's real, and the money you gave him changed everything. Gus studied the photos, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest. Tell Kevin I'm proud of him. And that electrical work isn't just a stepping stone. It's a foundation. Some of the most important work in the world happens in crawl spaces and junction boxes. Maggie smiled, and it transformed her face from pretty to striking. My dad would have loved that line. He was a lineman for 30 years. Died 4 years ago in a storm trying to restore power to a hospital. I'm sorry. That's a hard way to lose someone. It was. But he died doing what he believed in, helping people. Kevin and we try to honor that. He fixes the infrastructure that keeps the lights on. I help keep people alive until they get to someone who can fix them permanently. The conversation should have ended there. Gratitude, delivered photos, accepted duty, discharged. But Gus found himself not wanting her to leave this woman who talked about her work with the kind of pride Vivian had never shown for anything except closing a difficult case. Have you eaten? I was about to order Thai food for Ruby and myself. You're welcome to join us before your shift. Maggie hesitated, glancing at her watch. I really shouldn't. I need to be at the station by 8:30 and I still have to change. Thai food takes 10 minutes to arrive and 5 to eat. You'd be out of here by 8. She looked at him, assessing, then smiled. Okay, but I'm buying next time. The presumption of a next time hung in the air between them, acknowledged and unexamined. Ruby came downstairs, drawn by the promise of company. She interrogated Maggie with the efficiency of a detective conducting a witness interview. What's your favorite color? Have you ever saved someone's life? Do you like dinosaurs? What's the scariest call you've ever responded to? Maggie answered each question seriously, treating Ruby like an adult worth engaging. By the time the Thai food arrived, Ruby had declared Maggie acceptable and awarded her the privilege of sitting in Catherine's old chair, the one at the dining table that usually stayed empty. They ate pad thai and spring rolls while Maggie told stories about her work. The drunk who'd called 911 because he'd superglued his hand to his forehead on a bet, the elderly woman who'd survived a heart attack because her cat had somehow learned to activate Alexa and call for help. The teenager they'd pulled from a car wreck who'd walked away without a scratch, despite physics suggesting he should be dead. Ruby hung on every word, her dinner getting cold because she was too captivated to eat. Gus watched them interact, watched Maggie deflect Ruby's hero worship with humor and humility, watched his daughter light up in a way she hadn't since Catherine died. At 8:15, Maggie stood reluctantly thanking them for dinner and apologizing for having to rush off. Ruby hugged her without asking permission first, which Maggie handled with the easy grace of someone used to dealing with people in crisis. Gus walked her to the door. "Thank you for coming, and for the photos. They mean more than you know. Thank you for the scholarship. Kevin's going to do amazing things, and it's because you saw potential where everyone else saw statistics." She was halfway down the steps when Gus heard himself speak the words coming out before his brain had cleared them for release. "Maggie, would you want to get coffee sometime? When you're not saving lives and I'm not avoiding journalists?" She turned back, surprise and something else flickering across her face. "Are you asking me on a date, Mr. Sterling?" "I am. And please call me Gus. Mr. Sterling makes me feel like my father and he was an asshole." Maggie laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "Okay, Gus. Yes. I'd like that. Fair warning though, I Googled you during dinner using Ruby's bathroom. I know about the whole billionaire in disguise thing, the ex-wife, all of it. And you're still saying yes. I'm saying yes because you ordered Thai food for your daughter and actually listened when she talked about her rock collection. The billionaire part is interesting, but it's not the part that matters." Gus felt something in his chest ease a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "When are you free? I work 4 days on 3 days off. My next off rotation starts Thursday. Thursday works. There's a coffee shop in Brooklyn I used to go to. Overpriced lattes, exposed brick, the kind of place that thinks it invented espresso. I have complicated feelings about it. Sounds perfect. Text me the address." She gave him her number and he saved it immediately, sent a test message that appeared on her phone with a chime. She smiled at the screen, then at him, then headed down the steps toward a Honda Civic that had seen better decades. Gus watched her drive away, then returned inside to find Ruby standing in the hallway, arms crossed, expression smug. "You like her. She seems nice." "You like her, I can tell." Gus picked her up, carried her upstairs, despite her protests that she was too old for this. "Maybe I do. Would that be okay with you?" Ruby considered this with theatrical seriousness. Only if she keeps telling stories about saving people. And if she likes dinosaurs. Everyone should like dinosaurs. I'll make sure to ask on our coffee date. Ruby grinned, then grew serious. "Daddy, is Maggie going to take a test, like Vivian did?" Gus set her down on her bed, pulled the covers up to her chin. "No tests this time. If Maggie and I are going to be something, it'll be because we're honest from the start. No more hiding who I am." "That's good. Hiding is exhausting. Where did you learn that phrase from you?" "Yesterday. You said pretending is exhausting." Gus kissed her forehead, turned off the light. "Good night, Ruby. Sweet dreams about titanosaurs." The next 3 days passed in a blur of managed chaos. Gus did 2 interviews, one with Bloomberg, one with the Wall Street Journal, both carefully controlled conversations that focused on Sterling Apex's investment philosophy rather than his personal life. He declined the morning shows, the podcasts, the book deal offers that arrived like clockwork from publishers who smelled a bestseller in his story. Vivian's story leaked to Page 6 on Tuesday, pregnant, abandoned by her new husband, who'd moved out of their apartment citing irreconcilable differences and career complications, facing disciplinary review at her law firm for the ethics violation of creating a spectacle that had damaged client confidence. The internet had no sympathy. Neither did Gus, but he took no pleasure in her suffering either. She'd made her choices. Now she was paying the bill. Preston's resignation had been accepted, his name scrubbed from the firm's website, his LinkedIn updated to show he was exploring new opportunities, which was corporate speak for unemployed and unemployable. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of November day that made New York feel like it was posing for postcards. Gus dressed carefully. Jeans, a sweater Catherine had bought him years ago that he couldn't bear to donate, boots that cost reasonable money without screaming designer. He looked like a normal person, which was precisely the point. The coffee shop was the same one where he'd met Vivian, which felt either poetic or masochistic depending on perspective. Gus arrived early, ordered black coffee, claimed a table by the window where sunlight painted everything gold. Maggie walked in at exactly 11 wearing jeans and a Georgetown sweatshirt, her hair down for the first time since he'd met her. She spotted him immediately, smiled, navigated the morning crowd with the efficient movement of someone used to tight spaces and urgent situations. She sat down across from him, no coffee yet, just her and her smile and the weight of possibility. "Thanks for inviting me. I wasn't sure you'd actually follow through." "Why wouldn't I?" "Because I'm a paramedic who makes $48,000 a year and drives a car that's old enough to vote. You're a billionaire who owns buildings and companies and probably small countries. The math doesn't exactly add up." Gus leaned back, studied her face for signs she was testing him or fishing for reassurance. Found neither, just honest confusion about why someone in his position would be interested in someone in hers. "The math only doesn't add up if you think money is the variable that matters. I spent 2 years pretending to be someone else, and I learned that the people who care about money care about the wrong things. You're here because you wanted coffee with me, not with my portfolio. That's the only math I care about." Maggie's smile grew, some barrier between them dissolving. "Okay, good, because I was worried you were one of those rich guys who dates regular people as like a palate cleanser between heiresses." Gus laughed, genuine and surprised. "Number. I'm one of those rich guys who married someone who wanted the heiress lifestyle without the heiress baggage, and it destroyed us both. I'm looking for something different this time." "What's different?" "Honesty. From the start. No tests, no disguises, no waiting to see if you'll judge me by what I have instead of who I am." Maggie nodded slowly, processing. "So, full disclosure, I know who you are, what you're worth, and I'm here anyway. I don't care about the money except insofar as it's weird to date someone who could buy my entire neighborhood without checking their bank balance. But I can get past weird if you can. I can get past weird. I've lived in weird for 2 years. Normal sounds nice." They talked for 2 hours, coffee going cold and being replaced, the shop filling and emptying around them in waves. Maggie told him about growing up in Georgetown, about her father teaching her that work wasn't about the paycheck, but about the people you helped. About her mother who still worked at the same grocery store she'd started at 40 years ago and loved every customer by name. About Kevin, brilliant and driven, who'd wanted to be an engineer since he was 6 and had almost given up when the tuition numbers didn't make sense. Gus told her about building Sterling Apex from nothing, about Catherine and the lesson her death had taught him about the cost of chasing status. About Ruby, who was smarter than he'd been at her age and twice as stubborn. About the test with Vivian, and whether it had been fair or cruel or some combination of both. "I think it was human. You'd been hurt, and you were trying not to get hurt again. That's not cruel. That's just self-preservation." But I lied to her. Let her think I was someone I wasn't. You let her reveal who she was. There's a difference. If someone only loves you when they think you're rich, they don't actually love you. They love what they think you can give them. The words settled between them, true and uncomfortable. Gus had spent months justifying the test to himself, and here was someone who understood it without needing the justification. "What about you? Would you have dated me if you'd met me when I was pretending to be an electrician?" Maggie didn't hesitate. "Yes. My dad was a lineman. I grew up around guys who worked with their hands and came home exhausted. I respect that more than I respect people who push money around spreadsheets, no offense. None taken. I push a lot of money around a lot of spreadsheets. But you also used to do the actual work. That matters." They left the coffee shop at 1, stepping into afternoon sunlight that made the city look clean and possible. Maggie walked toward the subway and Gus fell into step beside her. "Can I see you again? Properly dinner. Maybe somewhere you pick so I can't accidentally take you somewhere that costs a month of your salary." Maggie stopped, turned to face him. "Here's the thing, Gus. I like you. I like how you talk about your daughter, how you talk about your work, how you don't apologize for having money, but also don't throw it around like it makes you better than everyone else. But I need you to understand something. Okay, I'm never going to fit in your world. I'm never going to be comfortable at galas or charity events or whatever it is billionaires do for fun. I work nights, I deal with blood and trauma and people at their absolute worst. My idea of a nice dinner is anywhere that doesn't make me change out of jeans. I don't need you to fit in my world. I need you to let me exist in yours sometimes." Maggie studied him, looking for the catch, the angle, the moment where this stopped being real and started being another test. "What did you just say?" "I said I don't need you to fit in my world. I'm tired of my world. I want to exist in a world where what matters is whether someone's okay, not whether they're important. Where people are measured by what they do not, what they have." That's a pretty speech. It's not a speech. It's exhaustion. "I'm tired of performing, Maggie. I just want to be myself with someone who doesn't need me to be anything else." She kissed him then, sudden and certain, her hands on his jacket pulling him close. The kiss lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, and when she pulled back her smile was different, less careful, more open. "Okay. Dinner. Saturday. There's a diner in Queens I love. Best pancakes you've ever had, and they don't care if you're a billionaire or a bum. I know that diner. I've been there." "Of course you have." She descended into the subway and Gus watched her go, feeling something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Not happiness, exactly, too early for that, but the possibility of happiness. The chance that maybe this time he'd found someone who could see him clearly and choose him anyway. His phone buzzed. "Richard. Sir, the Wall Street Journal piece just published. It's fair balanced, makes you look like a human being instead of a cautionary tale." "Good. Anything else?" Mrs. Vale's attorney called. "She wants to discuss the prenuptial agreement from your marriage. Something about Clause 7, subsection B. We didn't have a prenup. We got married in New York under standard community property provisions." That's what I told her. "She insisted there was documentation from Switzerland from your honeymoon. I checked. There was no Swiss registration, no international filing. I think she's grasping at straws." Gus felt cold settle in his stomach. Vivian's honeymoon had been a long weekend in Zurich, a trip she'd insisted on because she'd always wanted to see Switzerland. They'd done the tourist things, chocolate factories, mountain trains, a boat ride on the lake. They'd even visited a lawyer's office, not for a prenup, but because Vivian had wanted to see how Swiss legal offices differed from American ones. Professional curiosity, she'd called it. Except there had been papers. Papers in German that Vivian had asked him to sign just to see what Swiss contracts looked like. Gus had signed them, humoring her, not reading the fine print, because who read the fine print on tourism paperwork? Richard pulled everything from the Zurich trip. Hotel reservations, receipts, anything that shows where we went. And get me a German translator. Now. "Sir is everything. Just do it. I need to know what I signed." The weight felt like drowning in slow motion. Gus paced his study, Catherine's words echoing from years past. "Always read the fine print even when you trust someone, especially when you trust someone." He'd ignored that advice once, humoring Vivian's professional curiosity in Zurich. Now he might be paying for it. 6 hours later, Gus had his answer. The papers Vivian had asked him to sign weren't tourism documents. They were a binding prenuptial agreement registered under Swiss law, stipulating that in the event of divorce, Augustus J. Sterling waived all claims to any assets, holdings, or future earnings derived from Vivian Ashcroft's family business, including but not limited to any biological progeny resulting from the union. The language was careful, couched in legal terminology that made it sound like standard asset protection. But the effect was clear. If Vivian had known Gus was wealthy, she could have claimed he'd signed away his rights to their hypothetical children in exchange for a quick divorce. Except there were no children. Vivian was pregnant with Preston's baby, not Gus's. The prenup was worthless, a gun loaded with blanks designed for a fight that would never happen. Gus stared at the translated document, feeling something dark and familiar rise in his chest. She'd been planning this from the beginning. Not the divorce, she'd loved him in her way, but the exit strategy. The insurance policy in case the marriage to the electrician turned out to be a mistake she needed to escape cleanly. Richard stood in the doorway of Gus's study, his expression carefully neutral. "Sir, what would you like me to do with this information?" Gus thought about Vivian alone in whatever apartment she'd fled to after Preston left pregnant and facing professional discipline and social exile. He thought about the baby who would grow up hearing about the scandal, about the mother who'd gambled everything on status and lost. He thought about Maggie, who'd kissed him on a street corner and asked for nothing except honesty. Send a copy to Vivian's attorney. Let them know we're aware of the Swiss filing, that it's null and void because I have no biological children with Vivian, and that any attempt to leverage it would constitute fraud. Then file it away and forget it exists. You don't want to press charges for the deception, no. She's already lost enough. Let her keep whatever dignity she has left. Richard nodded, disappeared to execute the order. Gus sat alone in his study looking out at the Manhattan skyline, thinking about tests and truth and the cost of learning who people really were. His phone buzzed. Maggie. Still on for Saturday. Or did you come to your senses and realize dating a paramedic is going to be boring compared to your usual life? He texted back immediately. Saturday. Your diner. I'll bring Ruby if that's okay. She wants to properly interview you about the dinosaur question. The dinosaur question. Whether you like them. It's apparently a deal breaker. Tell Ruby I love dinosaurs, especially the ones with the long necks. They're my favorite. Gus smiled, pocketed his phone, and let himself believe that maybe finally he'd found someone who wanted him for the right reasons. Someone who measured worth in character instead of capital, who saw the man instead of the money. Someone who understood that love wasn't about tests or disguises or proving anything to anyone. It was about showing up honestly and hoping the person across from you did the same. He'd failed that test with Vivian, or she'd failed it with him, depended on who was grading. But with Maggie there would be no test, just honesty from the start and whatever that honesty built. It was terrifying. It was hopeful. It was, Gus thought, exactly what he'd been looking for all along.